Hey everybody, welcome to the first official episode of the Modern Mix. This is our podcast series where we're going to be talking about different issues or different topics or theories. Uh, we're going to have a weekly special of this going on. Today, we're going to be talking about communism. Just its theories, implications, comparing it to other systems, and having cases by case basis, essentially. Today we do have with us Professor Zappo, a political scientist. He is a very dear friend of mine who has taught me many things about uh, political science as a whole, but specifically with certain ideologies. A very smart man. I thank you for coming with me today, Professor. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for such a warm welcome.
No problem. All right, I think where we should start off for a lot of people, because today's subject is about communism. I think especially being in the West, because we live in the United States, I think there's a big negative sentiment towards communism or, things related to communism, such as socialism, or, things of the same, at least in the umbrella term of America, uh, that is kind of put in the same corner. Um, so I think there's a misconception genuinely that Americans have with communism. So I just want to start off by asking you, what is communism?
Communism is part of Marx's broader analysis of class society. And in the same way that feudalism succeeded slave society as industrial growth and different forms of creating products and organizing society emerged, capitalism then replaced feudalism. And in Marx's theory, socialism will eventually replace capitalism, and socialism will then be replaced by communism. And communism basically has a couple foundational principles when we get to that stage of human development. Marx theorized a classless, moneyless, stateless society with a common ownership of the means of production or how and what we use to make things. And it's basically dumbed down into the idea from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Basically, meaning that everyone will have whatever needs they have met, and everyone will be able to work within their own capacity. For example, in the Soviet Union, there were many jobs for people with different abilities, or how we used to say disabilities, just so that they are able to do something and participate in society. They're not alienated from society. Another principle itself is no more alienation. If you make something, you should be able to use it, you should be able to buy it. You shouldn't be so isolated from your labor and your life that you can't do anything. One of the great challenges we have in modern day capitalism is people being so alienated from their labor, they're not able to control or understand what they make or use what they make. They are subjugated by their boss that they take it home with them and bring it into their home lives, leading to, a lot of the patriarchal system that we have where men don't feel like they have any control in their work life. They don't have any control in their political life because democracy is much more complex than voting every 4 years, that they start taking it out on their home life where it's essentially, I can't have control anywhere else, so I'm going to dictate control here. And
Okay.
another facet of communism is economic planning. We don't need to overproduce everything and have over a million empty homes like we do have in the United States just for the sake of production. We should make things to meet humanity's needs.
All right. Thank you. I think that, I think that was a very, I mean, obviously it was going to be a good response regardless, but that was a really good response. I think where a lot of people get messed up with communism, though, specifically, is how it in actuality works, right? Because, a lot of people don't know a lot about, let's say, communism in detail, specifically the mechanisms and how things actually work. But this notion you hear in the West is a lot. It's, well, either one, it's why would everybody want the same thing, right? I should have more than someone else sometimes, this competitive nature that, capitalism thrives on. But as well, what does it I feel like people have a hard time understanding what does it look like on a day-to-day life because, you know, for someone like me, I'm really big into policy analysis, right? We're talking about communism right now. So this is something I do on a daily basis in communism, right? With the notion of I'm putting in the work that is needed for the community, and then I'm given what is needed for me, right? What if someone doesn't want to do something that the community needs, though, in particular, right? Because if the community doesn't, let's say, need, oh, obviously there'll always be a need for certain jobs, like, a certain, like, education, right? Someone has to make food, right? There'll always be certain jobs somewhere, right? But, we live in a very service uh, economy right now, right? We provide mostly services. They're not really community needs. So how do we take that and essentially translate that to communism? I feel like that's where a lot of people have a really hard time understanding, especially understanding their place within communism as well, if that system were to be implemented. What do you think?
So essentially, you're asking how do we go from a service-based socioeconomic setup into one more of communism?
Yes.
I wanted it's so we've never been able to reach communism. I want to preface with that. It took over 400 years of development to achieve the capitalist societies that we have today. Winding off feudalism was a long road, and any socialist experiments we had in the 20th century were very short-lived, unfortunately. So we never got to see them on a grander scale. In political science, we can't force societies to do certain things so that we could see the experiments. It's not like chemistry where we can just add chemicals and see what happens, but rather we have to wait for these processes to happen. So, in
Absolutely.
terms of changing society, it really begins with kind of what the Black Panthers did, which is a lot of community involvement and organizing people, helping people see what's wrong with society, what needs to be changed, and then discussing on a mass line level, as in everyone getting involved, what can we do to change it. We do keep the guiding principles of Marxism in place and use the Marxist method to understand things, but in order to get to the next stage, it involves a lot of community involvement. For example, the Black Panther Party, the CPUSA, or the Communist Party USA, particularly in the mid 20th century, focused a lot on education programs, a lot of community service programs where they were feeding poor people and the homeless, and then organizing people in different shops. So we've had a large exodus factory work in the United States, which served a lot or created a lot of jobs, and then the towns that were built around the factories then had to support the factories and their workers, so that created a lot of jobs. So I guess if you want a really distilled version, like extremely distilled, it would be organizing people, creating a quote unquote shadow government in the background, as in leadership that people can look to if stuff hits the fan. If
Mhm.
someday the government's not able to provide anymore, we have a system in place where people can rise up and take control, as in, provide medical care, provide education. But essentially, from my understanding in political theory and practice, is that transitioning from capitalism to socialism is based on two things, theory and practice. We use the theory of Marxism, we use practices that we've gained from other past movements. We look to the Soviet Union, we look to China, Vietnam, we look to the Black Panther Party, we look to the CPUSA, and how to organize people and convince them that they're being wage slaves, that there is a better society that we can replace it with. And as society regresses into a more violent state, as we kind of see now with the active brutality police are doing against everyday Americans, where we see what happened with Breonna Taylor and how the courts decided no, it doesn't matter that they shot her 50,000 times or whatever. We see people being disenfranchised with the system. And eventually, when the system is gone, or at a very weakened point, is when the communists believe that revolution is possible. Lenin spent 20 years not thinking revolution was going to happen within his lifetime, and then World War I happened, and the disintegration of the Russian Empire happened that allowed him to lead the revolution to its conclusion, at least in that part, the Civil War. Did the Soviet Union complete its socialist revolution? No. Revisionists in the 1950s started taking it back until it was devolved into a capitalist state and a social imperialist state. I
Mhm.
believe you had another part to your question, though.
Oh yeah, it was about the perception of uh, communism for the individual person, because this essentially more communal way of more of so this essentially more communal way of living with each other in communities, right? If we were to transition from this, the economy we have now to this more not late stage communism, but turning into a broad communist state with those ideas of trying to implement late stage, at least transition to late stage communism in that sense. I think people have a really hard time seeing their role in that, especially with the concept of you give to the community what is needed by the community, and then you get what you need in return, right? There's a lot of people who do jobs that don't necessarily satisfy a community need, right? There are tons of jobs that are out there that do satisfy community needs, but if we look at New York City, for example, right, there are tons of jobs in New York that don't contribute anything materially or in the sense of how I would think in a communist perspective, how you would think of uh, contributing to the community, right? So there are many jobs like that. Do those jobs now simply vanish, right? Do you now just get assigned a different job, or you just like? I think people get tripped up on that idea, especially because we're in a very capitalistic country that has always been capitalistic. So it's deeply rooted in our minds to think this way. So I think it's very hard for people to understand a different way of looking at it, and especially when you're talking about a big industrial capitalistic country like America. But but that was just one point. But I do want to get to something that you said because the two will connect. Um, you talked about Lenin, and he didn't think there was going to be a revolution the first 20 years, and you didn't think he was going to see it in his lifetime. What I want to ask is a little more of the about the origins of communism, because we talk about Marxist literature. I don't think most people have ever read Marxist literature, though. Frankly, at least put the number in half of the people who actually talk about it. I don't think they actually have read Marxist literature, especially in very anti-communist countries like the one we live in, right? So, can you tell me a little more about Marx and Engels specifically, and then we can move on to Lenin and then the revolution after that point?
Sure, I will go through a short biography of Marx and Engels that I put together for this, and then I'll tie it back into the service question. So, I mean, if we want to think about Marx, we have to think about the time he was living in. Now, he's born in 1818, so directly after the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, which was essentially a entire European front war that devastated the continent and also reshifted pretty much everything. It spread the ideas of the French Revolution of the late 1700s as well as the Enlightenment. You had this idea of self-determination and republicanism spreading across the continent. You had the Napoleonic Code, which was a major development in legal theory and stuff since the Codex Justinianus from the late Byzantine Empire. So basically, all of society was being changed throughout all of Europe, from Spain to Portugal to France. Influences did occur in Britain from Napoleon's wars to Germany and all the way to the Russian Empire. But I guess we need to really think about Marx post that, where he's growing up. So he's born in 1818, as I mentioned, in Trier in Prussia, which is in modern day Germany. Prussia was uh, pretty much the major state in forming Germany, since Germany was formed during his lifetime. He was of Jewish origin, but his father converted the family to Christianity in order to save them from persecution and to continue his career as a lawyer. So we see that persecution notion coming into mind and people not having their own determination to do what they want. Then Marx eventually studied at the University of Bonn and the University of Berlin and Jena, where he eventually earned his PhD in 1841. So getting closer to the Paris Commune time and the French Revolution of the mid 1800s. He was initially a Hegelian, but eventually became more radicalized and developed a materialist understanding of history while studying the works of Ludwig Freiburg. So materialism is rather than the idea comes from the Godhead or something and then we act upon it, but rather we observe everything that is knowable, that we can see, that's tangible, and try to understand how society came to be, rather than looking to ideas that philosophers are just thinking. We think that materialism is a better way of doing it. You do it through a historical material and dialectical materialism, which is a bit much to go through here, but for historical materialism, you see what conditions society has going on now and what led to those conditions and what we could do about it in the future. He basically took the scientific method from hard sciences like biology, chemistry, and applied it to social sciences, which really hadn't been done at his time, at least not in a sophisticated manner. But digressing, he moved around while attempting to become a professor. I kind of know what that's like. But he was unsuccessful due to the turbulent nature of his times. You know, it's kind of like today. Everyone wants an adjunct, not a real full-time professor. And he eventually found himself with his fellow left Hegelians, so were people that took Hegel's ideas and took them on a more left or Jacobin-inspired way. And
Hmm.
they founded a paper called the Rheinischen Zeitung in opposition to Prussian government. So basically, they were writing a newspaper that was critiquing the government and what atrocities and abuses they were doing at the time. And by October 1842, Marx had become the editor-in-chief and spent a considerable time working as a radical journalist, propagandist, and a revolutionary organizer. So we see the themes of spreading information, spreading propaganda in order to win people to your cause. So you could really just think of that as advertisements. The propaganda really has a negative taste in people's mouths in the United States, but if we
Hmm.
look at United States Marine Corps ads or the God Bless America signs everywhere, it's a form of American propaganda to show that we're the greatest country on earth,
Hmm.
or at least we believe so. And revolutionary organizing, organizing shops, organizing factories, organizing workers of all kinds. Um, so that kind of touches like it was still organizing restaurant workers, organizing people that worked in transit, that sort of thing, despite it being very primitive at the time. And
Hmm.
then by 1843, Marx married his childhood friend Jenny von Westphalen. She was the daughter of a wealthy German civil servant. And despite this, there's a leading idea that Marx was wealthy. He was not. He constantly suffered poverty because her family did not approve. It was hard for him to find work, and that aided in his understanding of capitalist oppression and also his connection to the working class and seeing
Hmm.
how their lives were. And Jenny was absolutely instrumental in the publication of his works, being able to decipher his otherwise illegible handwriting. He had terrible handwriting, and without Jenny and his eventual close friend Engels, he wouldn't have been able to publish anything, and his legacy probably would have died in the 1800s.
Okay.
Um, and they eventually moved to Paris because they constantly were getting exiled from wherever they were. And they worked on publishing more radical journals and observed the factionalism and labor movement growing there. You know, the two movements of labor and early utopian socialism, which is differing from Marxist socialism,
Hmm.
uh, that was developing in Paris. And then he eventually met Friedrich Engels, whom he worked with together and developed a lifelong partnership and friendship. And they spent the rest of their lives developing the principal social science tools to study and understand the world through a materialist conception of history, thus becoming some of the fathers of modern sociology. And they worked in revolutionary circles and constantly reported on events worldwide. For example, Marx steadily reported on the U.S. Civil War and the Paris Commune, and even wrote a couple letters to Abraham Lincoln. Um, and during his exile, he became further disenfranchised and relied heavily on Engels for the financial support. Engels was the son of a wealthy factory owner and eventually took up a managerial role of some sort in the factory in order to survive, as well as his writings. And Engels actually wrote some very good books, especially on the life of 19th century uh, British textile workers. They joined in 1864 a revolutionary socialist organization, which they transformed into the International Working Men's Association, or the First International, which was think about the UN, but for communists, sort of, where they worked
I
to
think that's a good
unite.
representation. I think that's a good
Yeah,
representation.
yeah, kind of. And they worked to unite the labor movement across Europe and the world. And their work became foundational for modern sociology and other social sciences like political science, an offshoot of sociology. So, a lot of what I've studied in my undergrad and grad career was based on how they rechanged the system. And then Engels, another great influential figure, he was also of German descent, a bit younger than Marx by a couple years. He was born in 1820 in a textile town of Barmen in Prussia, so also of German background. And his family were devout Protestants, with his father owning a cotton spinning mill. His hometown, which is kind of a very interesting place, was heavily influenced by French Enlightenment ideals spread through French conquest during the Napoleonic Wars. So a lot of French people and their soldiers settled there, and a lot of ideas based because of its location were traded essentially, and it allowed Engels to have some exposure to non-reactionary, non-conservative tendencies. So he started thinking about things differently. He attended the Barman Town School until his father removed him from it to become an apprentice in his office. Through Engels' formal, though his formal schooling ended, he continued to study history, philosophy, literature, and linguistics in his free time. So Engels, like Marx, was very much a polymath. While he was studying abroad and then eventually in the UK, he joined the Young German Literary Group and became a journalist. And according to the MLM Basic Course, which is Marxism, Leninism, Maoism by the Communist Party of India Maoist, quote, he exposed the severe, this was when he got to observing factories in his hometown. He exposed the severe exploitation of the workers in Barmen and Elberfeld, the diseases they suffered due to the poor conditions, and the fact that half the children of the town were deprived of school and forced to work in factories. Then he began 1 year of compulsory military service, took a philosophy course at Berlin University, and while studying as an external student, Engels learned of Hegel and his work, and leading him to come into contact with young Hegelians, just like Marx did previously. And according to CPI Maoist again, after going to Manchester, it was his experiences in England that made him a communist. He developed very close links with the workers of Manchester and the leaders of the revolutionary workers in the Chartist movement. Engels understood an in-depth study, or undertook an in-depth study of the working class and the living conditions of its workers, where he regularly visited the working class areas to gain direct knowledge, observing them in their working spaces and their living spaces, where he eventually met his wife, Mary Burns, who was a young, well, not a wife, they never married, but Mary Burns, a young factory Irish worker. Their development came from their personal experiences, whilst their education backgrounds.
Hmm.
Um, but Marxism as a science is distilled into German philosophy, which is the German understanding of Greek and classical philosophy, which is how Marx and Engels collaborate in their first intensive work, the German ideology. It also comes from English political economy, so studying the works of Ricardo, Adam Smith, big names in capitalism,
Yeah.
and many others to try to understand how we got to where we are and how previous political scientists, or nascent political scientists, I should say, were formulating their ideas. And then the last thing is French utopian socialism, which was a socialism based on ideals rather than concrete conditions, which Marx and Engels, as materialists, rejected and turned it into a science. How do we observe things? How do we put it into practice? Theory and practice, the core of Marxism. How do we take what we learn from German philosophy and British political economy and put it into a socialist practice? How do we turn it from ideas and lofty romancing about what could be and turn it into something actionable?
Okay. Well, thank you. That was a very well response. Again,
Thank
every
you.
time you give me an answer, I learn so much. um, I think for a lot of people, right, when if they get to the point where even reading for, I mean, even reading about communism, they go like, okay, well, let me read the Communist Manifesto. Let me read some, Marxist literature, right?
Right.
Hold on. hold on, we're about to run out of time. I'm gonna. Oh, we're running out of time in 10 minutes. Never mind. Sorry. Uh, it just sent me a notification. But a lot of people who go in to read this, literature, they see, especially coming from a capitalist society, mindset and that kind of perspective, they see a lot of things that I think come off frightening to them. For example, where we talk about the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? And even though if you understand, what what they're trying to, what the concept is, right? It necessarily shouldn't scare you, but like for a capitalist, right? You'll see this normal person in, New York, right? Like you keep using New York as this reference, but this normal person in New York, how do you get them to understand the necessity for a dictatorship of the proletariat, right? When there's been ingrained generations of like society should be this way, society should be capitalistic, this is how we do things, this is how we're done. It's the foundation of the country. You can go back to slaves, right? Slaves were, that was capital. People bought slaves, brought them over. Well, not, we know how that happened, but it was built on, those type of resources, those type of capital, right? So now how do you explain to somebody, not even from the United States, if we look at, I mean, it's a little different in other places, especially when you go to Europe because you have a little more social democracies. But how do you take the United States, for example, and explain to someone why we should have a dictatorship of the proletariat and why that's a good thing, right? Why is this idea that Marx and Engels, that Marxist literature has unnecessary? Because especially for people in America, you say dictatorship, it immediately turns them off, right? So what would you say to that?
I think we need to break it down into really like three things.
Okay.
One is understanding what it means by dictatorship in this context, as well as what
Mm-hmm.
is the proletariat or the working class, and what is the bourgeoisie or the capitalist owning class or the bosses. So I'm gonna start with proletarians, bourgeoisie, and then get to the dictatorship of the proletariat. So in its distilled form, according to Engels, who wrote a great book on understanding the very basic principles of communism, which he aptly titled The Principles of Communism. He said that the proletariat is a class in society which lives entirely from the sale of its labor and does not draw profit from any kind of capital, whose weal and woe, whose life and death, whose sole existence depends on the demand for labor. Thus, we find that the proletariat is not defined by the typical sociological category of the quote unquote working class, as we're so often told in political science. You have the working class or the lower class, the middle class, or the upper class, but rather, and not defined by income brackets, but rather by a historical entity distinguished from its role in wage labor. So our class is based on how we interact with capital in our society. Are we the ones that own it, or rather the ones that produce it? So most proletarians, or the working class, which I'll use from now on, are poor, but this is not necessarily the case. We can have a celebrity that may be a proletarian because of them having to work for subsistence, but they may have a large income. Though in vain, many poor industrial workers would be proletarians, or in the same vein, rather. The distinguishment between proletarians and the capital class is that the proletarians, or the working class, must work for subsistence. They must work for their food and labor. Um, and the bourgeoisie don't. They take the surplus labor, which I can explain the formula for that in an example in a moment if you'd like, to gain their money and gain their subsistence, so to speak. Then we also have the petite bourgeoisie, who are really closer to being proletarians than they are capitalists, but they aspire to be capitalists. You could think of the local bodega owner or a small business owner. They do a lot of work. They're not just sitting around or not even there collecting the surplus value of their workers, but rather actively engaging. So in that sense, they're closer to workers. However, they aspire to be capitalists and they see themselves more aligned with the capitalists because they own a business.
Hmm.
Also tying into your question about um, surplus workers, but not exactly. I mean, service workers. They're not essentially the lumpen proletariat, but the similar groups of workers can be put into that. So the
Okay.
lumpen proletariat are the destitute workers in society who are separate but closely related to the proletariat, meaning they don't necessarily have a revolutionary basis behind them. Like we think of train conductors and transit workers as people that could shut down the economy because they could shut down travel, which we saw earlier this year or last year with the New Jersey transit workers potentially striking. This includes prostitutes, gangsters, so the mafia, and the chronically unemployed who become isolated from society, essentially forming the army of reserved labor. Then we have the bourgeoisie, or the capitalist class, the bosses, who are the primary antagonists of most workers worldwide. This is a class that owns the means of production as their private property. They own like the factory machines and stuff, for example. Um, and they wield political power above and beyond our false liberal democracy. In political science, for example, in American government, and the course I'm teaching right now, we talk about how other than our typical democratic forces of your voters and parties, we also have elites, interest groups, lobbyists, all these different organizations and individuals that have significant power that wield society. If we look at, for example, the 2020 election, we saw Bernie Sanders was in the lead, and then suddenly, overnight, basically, Joe Biden became the number one Democratic choice, and everyone started dropping out like flies. This was not natural, of course. Bernie had a lot of the ideas and aspirations that the people have been voting for, abortion access, universal health care, etc. But we saw the Obama family, as well as their compatriots in the Democratic Party elites, calling the individual candidates and asking them to drop out and support Joe Biden. And effectively, that's how we got Joe Biden as our president.
Hmm.
But digressing, we see that the capitalists usurped aristocracy and monarchs uh, during the dialectic historical shift from feudal to capitalist society, as I mentioned earlier. And thus, the capitalists often wield a lot of parliamentary power, as I just mentioned, with like Obama being an elite, but we see titans of industry having the same kind of power. And they use parliamentary democracy, like we have, though we don't have a parliament, as a show to prevent uprisings. But in cases of extreme upheaval, we see the workers, the bosses will utilize fascism to crush rebellion. So, when people get disenfranchised enough, we start seeing a militaristic police crackdown rather than using our false democracy in order to get things done. Um, which ties into what is a bourgeois democracy or a capitalist democracy, a liberal quote unquote democracy, which is a government that serves the interests of the bourgeois class. The word democratic is often attached to such a government because all people in such a society have certain freedoms. Um, those who own the means of production, the bourgeoisie, are free to buy and sell labor power and what is produced by it solely for their benefit. Those who own only their ability to labor, the proletariat, you and me, are free to sell themselves to any capitalist to buy their labor power and maintain their survival or subsistence. It gives greater strength and power to the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class. Also, bourgeois society, according to Marx, or rather Marxist.org, is a social formation in which the commodity relation, or the relation of buying and selling, has spread to every corner of life. The family and state still exist, but the family is successfully broken down and atomized, which I was talking about with alienation, more and more resembling the relationship of a commercial contract rather than one genuinely expressing kinship and the care of one generation for the other. You see father and son constantly competing for things, for example.
Hmm.
Um, the state retains its essential instruments of violence, such as the police or the military, but more and more comes under the sway of commercial interests, such as Amazon. Alphabet, uh, Apple, etc., and reduced to act, or a perfect example, Exxon, and are thus reduced to acting as a buyer and seller of services on behalf of the community. We can see this especially with trickle-down economics and Reagan's idea of everyone that benefits at the top will eventually make everyone at the bottom benefit because what is best for the business industry or industries is best for the rest of us. Let businesses have free reign and let them dictate society. But we know the businesses, since they're not service oriented towards the people, will always serve what makes them the most money first.
Of course,
I
yes.
once had a professor in public administration say the government is not efficient on purpose because it's not supposed to cut corners. It's supposed to get things done for what people need. But we see that is not true, and we see corporate interest and corporate mindset being more important than serving the people. Uh, and then that
Wait,
ties into
hold on.
neoliberalism.
I'm sorry. Quick question.
Yeah,
So, especially, obviously, we're both well versed in politics to understand that corporations in America have a huge influence. I, the average day person knows that. We seen huge organizations donating millions upon millions of dollars for certain candidates or for certain views and ideologies to promote them. From that perspective, right? How would you say, from a Marxist perspective, how would you look upon that in American society? How would you see that? Because obviously, there's a very strong focus on Marxism on doing what's best for the workers, the actual people. Especially as you talked about earlier in defining what actually classifies uh, uh, a proletariat. How does essentially I'm trying to put my thoughts together because how does essentially, from a Marxist perspective, how would you view the American system in regards to lobbying, in regards to corporations being being deeply ingrained in the politics? Obviously, we have certain laws and regulations. Like, okay, you can't do this. This is okay. We're always debating them to see like in the system that we have. But from a Marxist perspective, how would you see the system?
how do I view it?
Yeah.
Essentially, I view it as late stage capitalism, um, and getting to the point of imperialism as Lenin theorized, which I can cover a bit more later. Uh, Actively devolving into fascism. I mean, we need to look no further than the student protests over the genocide in Palestine to see how the government reacted with their crackdowns and with their police brutality, pushing old people, beating on students, this whole idea of, oh, you could protest and even if you're peaceful, I'm not even talking about the people that were breaking windows or anything, just getting harassed by the police of the administrations. It's like the 60s all over again with people getting hosed down, dogs sicked on them. We look at, the assassination of Fred Hampton and other Black Panther Party members. We see the bombing of the Move building. I believe it was Philadelphia, if I'm not 100% sure, where we had the government literally bomb an entire block of civilians to curb their thoughts. We see COINTELPRO or what do you call it? The counterintelligence program from the 50s to the 70s, which still goes on today. You can still hear from the C or read on the CIA website that they're still actively hunting down communists. Maybe not nearly as violently as they once did, but we see the government working on taking down any dissenters, even if they don't do anything illegal, because they're so afraid of change. Uh, So yeah, we absolutely see fascism brewing in this country. It's not from just like how many liberals would say Donald Trump, but we see it from Kamala Harris, we see it from Joe Biden. We see them forming a police state or expanding our
Hmm.
police state. We see them cracking down on free speech. We see them uh, destroying our economy. And I'm not just saying Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, I'm talking about everyone because they're transforming it to something that's only service, where people are even more alienated and they have to work for even lower wages and they can't afford anything. The other
Hmm.
day, I went to the grocery store and organic milk, which is far better than regular milk because it doesn't have all the chemicals that they use to treat it and thus affecting the meat milk, was $10 for 1 gallon.
Wow.
Uh,
Mm. Wow.
a, a year or 2 years ago, the same one was like $4, which was still outrageous. I remember
Hmm.
when milk was $1, but
Hmm.
$10 is absolutely crazy. And then even regular uh, American products have gone up so much. Uh, but in terms of fascism, we absolutely see us devolving into it. Uh, Look at our policy in the Middle East. Look at how we're bombing the crap out of Gaza. We're bombing the Yemenis. I mean, it's very pathetic that we need to have over 800 military bases across the world and still say, "Oh, we're being threatened." It's like, not really. China is
Hmm.
threatening us. Then stop surrounding them with military bases. I mean, it's ridiculous. So in effect, I do see the country devolving into fascism. I think it's going to get a lot worse before it could potentially even get better.
Okay.
We're going to see these right-wing militias that we've been seeing in the woods and now actively in the streets of many areas, uh, becoming more disenfranchised with how society is, and it's just going to get more violent. I think tying into that is a very good definition of fascism by the political scientist Robert Paxton, which kind of
Hmm.
encapsulates everything I've been saying, where he said fascism may be defined as a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, or, we see people being obsessed with the white race is dying or some nonsense like
Hmm.
that. Humiliation. Oh, the immigrants are taking our jobs, and we're lesser people. Men are not men anymore because of feminism, that sort of thing. Or
Yeah.
victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants, working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites, abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing or external expansion. So we see that. We see that here in the United States. We see that these militias are terrorizing people. We see that they're hurting people. We look at um, the recent violent riots in Britain where they're burning down mosques, they're attacking stores. It was very reminiscent of Kristallnacht in the 1930s.
Hmm.
This is happening everywhere. It's not a it's a natural development of capitalism. When capitalism decays, it becomes imperialism and eventually becomes fascism. It may not be the fascism of the 1930s with the black shirts and the leather boots and yada, 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 but we
Hmm.
still see the decay of society and control by violence, which ties into your earlier question of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. People may be afraid of the term dictatorship of the proletariat, but it really means the dictatorship means that the working class are in charge. We have our own ability to control our destiny and control society. Right now, we live in the period of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. We live in the period where the capitalist class, the owning class, controls every facet of our lives. Look how quickly the media has shifted from their views on Kamala Harris to being, or before she was the vice president that no one talked about, shunned from the political arena, and now suddenly she's our saving grace against Trump. She is our leader. She is brat or whatever. You know, we see them using media, manipulating media. Uh, Another example is when they were manipulating media in the early 2000s with the Iraq War. They had weapons of mass destruction and were killing babies, and it all turned out to not be true. We see the arguments now for Israel. We see the arguments for Ukraine, etc. Right? Um, So we're seeing this soft power. We're seeing the hard power with the police and our military apparatus. We see how multi-billion dollar corporations like Exxon halted information on climate change, and how we see the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025 controlling information and openly advocating for fascism with their obsessive fear of demographic change, white replacement theory, right? This is the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. This is where they control us and they decide what we do. Democracy cannot and simply is not something as simple as voting every 4 years. How can you have control over your political life, which thus impacts every part of your life, as you know from studying political science? Everything is politics. We are political animals. We cannot get anything done without politics, right?
Hmm.
Um, we have that in mind. And it's like, okay, I only vote every 4 years, and then my choices are limited. I can only vote for two parties that both represent capitalist interests. The only third party that comes even close to that or to something moderately different is the Green Party, and they're still social democrats at best. And at worst,
Hmm.
they're corporate green politics, right?
Hmm.
Uh, you're telling me that we have to choose between Kamala Harris and Trump, who are both like, actively debating who loves Israel more, who can serve the
No.
business class more. This fake populism that they promote is nothing. It's useless. This is the
Hmm.
dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. The dictatorship of the proletariat is much more along the lines of democratic centralism, where we collectively reach decisions in a communist manner, uh, where, a good definition, which I have pulled up right now, according to Progressive Labor Party, which is, uh, in my opinion, based on political theory, is a very good Marxist party in understanding things. Not the
Hmm.
Social Democrats, the CPUSA, or whatever. They define democratic centralism as something that enables the party to act as a united solid phalanx, uniting leaders and members, developing confidence and iron discipline based on voluntary association. How do we do democratic centralism in a communist party as well as in society? Lower bodies, quote unquote, make ideas. They're proposed and collectively criticize and self-criticize their own ideas, and then it's proposed to a higher body and a higher and higher and higher body until a decision is reached. For example, say there was an organization in New York, they proposed it, it would then go to New York as a state level organization, and then using the U.S. as an example of a federal organization, and once a quote unquote Politburo, political bureau makes a decision, it becomes binding upon everyone else. But everyone from the lowest little organization in some shop area in the Bronx makes a proposal, goes all the way to the top, all the way back down until a decision is made. That's why Soviet bureaucracy was so slow at times, because you'd have people from, I don't know, Kazakhstan in some factory there proposing ideas, then they go to their city level, state level, and so on and so forth. An excellent non-communist example, but rather uh, an anarchist actually example, is Rojava, or the I forgot what the was it the Syrian Democratic Union, or I forgot what they call themselves
Hmm.
now,
Hmm. Yes.
but it's
Hmm.
the Kurdish forces in Syria. They implemented a system called democratic confederalism. Basically, at a neighborhood level, you raise issues, you come up with a plan. That goes to the commune level, so kind of think of, or no, it goes to the city level. So think of, say you're in Jersey City, your neighborhood of like 12 blocks comes up with an idea after meeting as a committee. You then tell your citywide representatives, and it goes on and on and on until you get to the whole area of Rojava. And that's how they make decisions based on democratic centralism. So
Hmm.
with democratic centralism, with everyone being able to participate, which they're currently hindered from doing so because they're working like slaves to just pay for anything, um, we eventually can have a dictatorship of the proletariat where the working class dictates, it decides, it discusses how we should run society and why we should run society. There should be no reason why people of any class have to suffer uh, the amount that they do. We have more than enough food. We throw out, look at all the food restaurants and supermarkets throw out. We have enough food. We have more than double the amount of empty new homes than we do homeless people. It's not a matter of letting business do business. It's a matter of we need to control society and do what is best for humanity, or else we're either going to die from infighting and civil war, or we're going to die from climate change. We can't vote our way out of climate change on its own. We need to have action. We need to be decisive. We need to have the leadership of the working class.
Okay. I mean, I think a lot of people would like, or at least like the sound of that, right? Especially in a polarized political society that we have right now, right? Everyone's at each other's throats. It's he says this, she says that. You're Democrat, Republican, can't go either way, right? It's very polarized, and majority of people fall within those two parties because we do live in a two party system. But we do see not mass exodus, but within this obvious election, people are disenfranchised. They really when it was Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, it was really bad because many people really wanted either candidate, to be honest. But as you did say, I mean, I know with Kamala Harris, I mean, this will veer into a different topic, but I think even from I do agree with you completely in the sense that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are two sides of the same coin. And in terms for the working class people, they really do not do much. Especially being an African American as myself, right? I one, we are not a monolith, but two, the Democratic Party takes black vote takes the black vote for granted. It does. You talked about 1 minute when Joe Biden was running the original term, uh, Bernie Sanders was winning the primaries. Then the next minute, Joe Biden was winning the primaries, right? And then went on to the nomination, right? That happened after he the primary election in South Carolina, which majority of African Americans voted for him, right? So, the Democratic Party does take the black community for a vote, absolutely, while the government actively does do things that suppresses the black community. You did talk about like Fred Hampton, 110%. The FBI raided the building he was in and killed him in his sleep, right? So, like these aren't questions for us, but then knowing all this and hearing all that, why do you think people aren't ready? Not even let's say for communism, right? But why do you think people aren't ready for socialism that could lead to eventual communism, right? Obviously, it has to do in part with we live in a capitalist society, right? There's obviously a pushback from capitalists, right? We've always been a capitalist, how we were founded, right? So there's obviously going to be a I wouldn't say no, I would say that there's obviously going to be a natural pushback. People don't like change in general, right? Even when that's just with the concepts and their ideas. So there's going to be natural pushback to that. But especially, if you're, we defined what the proletariat was earlier, but in the sense of for identity politics in America, right? You know, you're a working class, guy from the middle Kentucky, you have a blue collar job, right? Or you're an African American and you as well have a blue collar job, right? Or you are a member of the LGBTQ community, right? At some point or another, capitalism actively tried to suppress these groups, right? Like we don't. This isn't a conversation, right? We know laws, ordinances that have been in place, right? That makes work harder and makes workers more like slaves. As you said, we we know all of this, right? I think though, people really have a hard time grasping with the concept of complete democracy, especially in America, right? Which will bring me on to my next little portion with I'm going to ask you about a case example specifically, but I think people have a little bit of a fear of direct democracy because that people don't like massive government, genuinely speaking, I would say, right? In the sense of, we get funding, we get money, from the social, if you're a Democratic Party sense, right? Like in that mindset, right? But people don't like government telling them what they can and can't do most of the time. People like government telling them that they have the right to do things, but they don't like them telling them what they can and can't do, though. So I really do think a direct democracy, as you know, what you would see in communism, would be really, really hard for the American psyche, especially because we're very America centered in living in the United States. We've always has been, right. That's the way. That's what we use as propaganda. It's always we're the best, we're the center of the world, right? So I think that that's going to be very hard for the American psyche, and I continuously think that's why people have a hard time grasping, communist perspectives, even though people will say either one communist or socialist ideas or policies. Especially, I think within the Black community itself, a lot of Black people talk about socialist policies, socialist agendas, but don't realize it's that because there's so much negative propaganda around socialism, that word, because it leads to communism. Like these are dirty words in our society. But many people, especially with Gen Z, right, and this younger generation now, calling for more social welfare protections, right, more money being funded to these things, greater like allocations for these programs. These are increasingly socialist and socialist and socialist policies that should, at least, depending on how it can actually work in application, but that should work out, right? So why do people actively vote against this then? Because we've seen many cases where policies, people vote in their own disinterest many times just because it might be a socialist policy, right? It might be a more far left policy, right? As as we would think about it in the contemporary American political sense. But one, there's that. Two, as we were talking about, what it means, we're living in the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Can we, obviously, capitalism has had a much longer time to grow. It's had a much longer time to figure it out on how it can work for itself. And frankly, it's not meant to work for everybody. It's meant to work for the bourgeoisie, right? They figured out the system that works for them, right? Had a much longer time at doing it. They failed and tried many times, but they figured it out to where we got to this point where we're at now, right? With communism, though, one, Marx wrote what the Communist Manifesto maybe like 125 years ago, maybe max 150. So there hasn't been a lot of time to test these things, right? And the countries that we have tested them, I would say, it's mixed outcomes for the best. But, from a political perspective, that is to be expected, right? From the realm of societal opinion, obviously that's going to be looked more negatively upon. But if we're going to talk about in the realm of societal opinion, right, and intersect that with, political science, I think we do have to ask the questions of why aren't these communist countries working? And obviously some of them have done much better than others, right? We talk about Cuba and specifically with Cuba and their healthcare. Cuba has many doctors. Cuba sends doctors to other regions, other places in the region to help people, right? They're, they might not have the best pay in the world, right? But it's not about the pay. It's about, community and then helping everyone around you, right? The social welfare aspect. So, but, Cuba in the same uh, time, though, has had their own challenges, right? Obviously, these can be due to different issues. They were under an embargo by the United States, right? So, these are obviously things that go into that. But I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, okay, how could, how come it, because this sounds really good, this down, from down up the democratic structure where, people all get their voices heard. How come it doesn't work necessarily, let's say, for the Soviet Union, right? Or let's say from China is a little different because they're still communist but have some capitalist policies, so they're their own unique thing in that sense. But Vietnam, Laos, right? Even if you want to look at the Democratic Republic of North Korea, right? Cuba, right? You know, these are all socialist communist countries. How how come it's not working, or at least from our perception, as you know, obviously in America we're Western imperialists. That's what we are, right? But for the average worker, for the proletariat, right? For them viewing this, if they see it's not working in other places, why would they want to do it here, right? Now, and yes, you could say, you know, what would be better to live under the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie or the dictatorship of the proletariat. I think the issue, though, many people would probably say right now the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie because they might not like the societal look of what the dictatorship of the proletariat looks like, and then what communism will again continuing until late stage communism, even though no country's done that yet, but to that path. So I think that's a question we really have to talk about. So in this case, I do want to ask you of let's say Cuba, for example, right? Why? And honestly, I think Cuba has done very well for the position that it's been put in. But why do you think, right, for Cuba, and we can talk about, you know, Fidel and, you know, what his interpretation of, you know, communism meant for, you know, the country, but why did, how can we look at Cuba, this communist country, right? And then what are the good things? What are the bad things for why an average, you know, proletariat here in America, right, would want to switch to communism? I think that's a good place to start, so we can show people, in a sense, what does life actually look like in a communist state? Because we could theorize all we want, but you know, as we talked about earlier, theory only gets you so far. You know, we have to practice with people, you know, because that's how politics are. So, from that perspective, what would you say?
I think there were like 15 questions in
Oh,
that,
I'm
so
sorry. I'm
it's gonna
sorry.
be a bit hard to unpack, not gonna lie. Um, I think first and foremost, we have to understand that the United States did not begin with capitalism, but rather
Mm-hmm.
mercantilism. It developed into capitalism. Then do we have to remember that people are, yeah, people are naturally opposed to change, but change is a necessary part of life. Everything's constantly in motion unless you're a rock, and even that has its own life cycle per se, with, you know, being destroyed by the weather. Um, but life is change, life is movement. But when we have a system that's been spending the last, what, 80 years or so, no, more, since World War One, actively propagating against socialism and against communism and against Marxism and the like, it's going to be very hard. It's very hard to touch base with people, but that's the goal of a communist party. They have to, at least in their theory and practice of what we've seen them do throughout history, is they have to go out to the people, talk to them about the ideas, and win them over. Maybe you have to use different words. You know, I know that the Progressive Labor Party, for example, doesn't use the word proletariat very much. They use working class. They don't say capitalists, they say the bosses. You know, you have to use language that people understand and are less afraid of. You
Mm-hmm.
can't spend, or it's a very difficult task to undo over 100 years of anti-communist propaganda and anti-communist movements where communists were assassinated, where communists were unduly imprisoned, where we've gone to war with socialist countries or burgeoning socialist countries, when we bombed the heck out of Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, where we tried to overthrow the burgeoning Soviet Union when 17 countries invaded them during their civil war to try to help the Tsar win, or the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, or our extensive bombing campaign of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea or North Korea, where we leveled every single building over 2 stories and killed an unknown amount of people. For me, I don't know how many.
Mm-hmm.
Or anytime we see something we don't like. Salvador Allende, the self-proclaimed Marxist socialist in Latin America. We used right-wing forces to overthrow him. He committed suicide, and then they had a terrible dictatorship that killed thousands of uh, indigenous people and imprisoned many others under Allende. Uh, how do we combat that? We have to be extremely militant. It's about discipline. It's about organizing people and being ready to, well, as Marx spoke about it, and Lenin and Engels and everyone else, and put into practice. It's about fighting. You're fighting for
Hmm.
your life. It's not, you're fighting for your life every day now. In the United States, it doesn't look as bad as many other places, but we're decaying. You see some people in absolute destitute poverty, and they are fighting for every single thing they can get, and it's only going to get worse. Um, in terms of socialist or attempted socialist countries, I would not necessarily say that any of them are particularly socialist, um, but they have definitely been trying, and many have failed. We see China, for example. Despite China very much being on the capitalist road, especially since Deng Xiaoping, uh, we see that out of the over 800 million people that were lifted out of poverty, that Obama referenced in his speech in Cairo,
Hmm.
almost all of them, over 90%, were in China alone. We see that
Wow.
China has built thousands and thousands of schools, hospitals, created so many jobs, created better living conditions that did not exist in China when it was a feudal society, when it was a capitalist society. You know, it, you just can't do it with the anarchy of development that we have in capitalism,
Hmm.
where businesses just have to figure things out themselves and hope for the best, and hopefully we don't have to bail them out like we constantly do. This whole free market is nonsense if we're constantly having to bail out the banks and bail out the corporations. But digressing, I mean, we look at the Soviet Union. They were headed in a very good direction. There's a lot of misconception about Stalin, for example,
Hmm.
especially with his relationship with Ukraine. I can't really get into it now because it's going to be long, but a
Yeah.
colleague of mine, Dr. Grover Furr, has wrote extensively about that history. You can even read from non-communists and anti-communists such as what's his name? I'll get back to you with the name, but
Yeah, of
he
course. Thank
wrote
you.
a book that critiques Stalin. He was an African American, and he critiqued Stalin, but he also showed what the Soviet Union did well. Or you look at Anna Louise Strong and her tours of North Korea, China, and the Soviet Union, showing what she saw in daily life during the revolutionary period and the Civil War and thereafter. Or Ludo Martins and his book Another View of Stalin. You see, the collectivization that happened in Ukraine was for their benefit. Um, it was monocropping. The kulaks are kind of like, I guess you could say, the wealthy farm owners uh, were stealing from the poor, and during the collectivization period, were burning their own crops in order to spite the government. We had this horrible famine that would always happen in the Russian Empire because of inefficient labor practices, exploitation, and also natural disasters. With collectivization and the building up of industrial uh, masses, we saw that this stopped. And these famines did not happen again until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the late 19 and the early 1990s. Um, so we see that many things have been tried and not necessarily have succeeded. I mean, the Soviet Union was an extremely educated country in the 1950s. Our own CIA found that the Soviet people, on average, had a higher caloric intake than the average American. They ate better. They had better
Hmm.
food. They had better housing. Look at the Stalinkas, the Brezhnivkas, and the Khrushchevkas, the mass housing that was supposed to be temporary after World War II, but still lasts today. They're not in great shape, but they
Hmm.
housed people. There was no unemployment in the Soviet Union for the majority of its existence because they were able to create jobs for absolutely everyone, even if it was something minor. But from China to Cuba, socialism was tried, perhaps. Did it fail to lead to communism? Perhaps. But revolutionary leaders lied, and quote unquote fake communists lied, like Deng Xiaoping. Instead,
Hmm.
they maintained the fundamental capitalist institutions such as wage labor and nation states. And thus, we that plus with So keeping capitalist policies and institutions and programs, as well as constantly being attempted to be thwarted from the outside, from the United States and other countries, we see they failed. It was too hard for them at that time. They weren't industrialized enough. They were constantly fighting an uphill battle with opportunists in their own party and their society, and with countries like us trying to overthrow them all the time. I mean, we tried to assassinate Fidel Castro over a hundred
That,
times, sometimes in
yeah.
very creative ways, like exploding pens, poisoning his swimsuits, trying to
Wow.
have a woman seduce him and then not be able to. And that one's a very funny story, but we can't say it because we're trying to keep it PG-13. Um, but yeah, I mean, you have the betrayal of the labor aristocracy or the false labor leaders. You have the betrayal of opportunists in the party like Khrushchev or Deng Xiaoping, um, as well as these external forces. It's very hard to succeed. So we just have to keep trying and learn from their past mistakes, um, and get rid of the people that try to buy off the intellectuals of the party, um, in order to move forward. I believe you had a couple other things. Um, But trying to envision a socialist society, we can see where the Soviet Union went well. Cuba went well with their medical programs. We could see with their education programs. Think about the Soviet Union. Early 1900s, backwards, semi-feudal society, no industrial capacity, couldn't do a goddamn thing right.
Hmm.
And by the 1950s, they were in space. They defeated the Nazis with some help with our land lease program, but they really did industrialize a lot, behind the Iron Curtain, so to speak. Um, they defeated the Nazis. They went to space before us. They had living people and animals in space first. We got to the moon first, but hey, most satellites and everything else, they were winning. The majority of the space waste was won by the Soviet Union. So we can't say that they were abject failures. If they were abject
Hmm.
failures, then people that lived through the Soviet Union and vaguely remember it today in Russia and many former Soviet countries wouldn't want it back. I mean, there are a lot of people that don't want it back, but like anything, we need to know that there is no unbiased media. We have to look at, okay, what was their background? Were they kulaks? Were they wealthy? Or were they just people that got screwed over, like anywhere else? We find many people in the United States disenfranchised with the United States, but we don't think that it's enough to overthrow the United States, right? We try to move through our democratic processes. So we really got to look at who's talking. Or like there's that woman Young Park or something like that that
Hmm.
that talks about North Korea, and we find out she's constantly just making up lies and she's paid millions of dollars to talk about North Korea. And she
Hmm.
absolutely was in prison, but for something ridiculous. Or we look at propaganda against other countries like remember like what was that 10 years ago or so there was that guy that got arrested for supposedly just stealing a poster in North Korea.
Hmm.
No, he was also taking pictures of military bases, which in the United States, you can't just go take pictures of military
Yeah.
bases, right? You're going to get arrested. Same thing in North Korea. What do you expect? Especially since he was trying to sell it to our intelligence apparatuses. Um, so I guess condensing everything to try to keep it short and sweet is we need to learn from the past. We need to.
All right. Um, well, that was definitely a very informative response and a very good response. I definitely think, you put into a perspective of where people can understand, no system is inherently, I would say, good or bad, and each has their, inefficiencies and each has their, strong points. And especially with communism being a new system, a new form of doing things, especially in the grand scheme of human history, like 150 years ago, 125 years ago, when Marx writes, the Communist Manifesto. That's not a long time ago. So, relatively. So it's still definitely, as you say, there are strong points and there are weak points on why reasons in socialist systems or socialist systems that the hopes of becoming communist one day you know aren't as efficient as they could be. And that's even though the basis of it is efficiency. There are external factors that go into it, and as well internal factors. So I definitely think pointing that out is a really good thing for the average person who really doesn't understand or wants to go in more in-depth research about it. I think genuinely you have to understand these things. Um, I just want to say thank you, Professor. This was incredible. I know we had a long conversation. You went through a lot of things. I didn't mean to drag you through all that, but once
No
again,
problem at all.
yeah, once again, you show me, the brilliance that you hold. It's a
Oh,
pleasure talking to
stop
you.
it.
It really is. It's a pleasure talking to you, learning, and seeing things from these perspectives. Talking about, as two intellectuals talking, I do think, we do need more of that in today's day and society, so we can hear what other people are thinking, or what other people have studied, or what other people, are experts in. So once again, just thank you for your time and coming onto the podcast and doing this with me.
You're very welcome, and I'd love to partner with you again in the future.
Absolutely. We can go on for hours about this. Luckily this was just the introduction. If we make a full one, it'd be 7 hours long and have everybody just sleeping at that point. But
Yeah,
of course,
hopefully.
it just no, yeah. Uh, but thank you. It really, very informative. Great as always. So I thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.